This is a chill wind from the Cold War that's blowing across the world today. We obviously don't know how far advanced these weapon systems are technically, but clearly the Russians do have an intent to develop new weapons capabilities, including these very advanced nuclear weapons capabilities.
What are the penalties for violating the contraventions of various nuclear treaties?
Well, I think it's very interesting that the Russians are trying to manufacture a justification to potentially break out of the New START agreement. That would give them the ability then to ramp up production of warheads and missile delivery systems to significantly steal a march on an advantage over the United States. The United States would have to respond to that if the Russians did in fact break out, and so therefore you could be potentially back into a more competitive US-Russian nuclear relationship reminiscent of the arms race of the Cold War.
Can the US, in your view, match these new weapons that Russia says it is indeed developing?
I think the US will be looking very seriously at the hypersonic weapons capabilities that the Russian president announced. But two of the other weapon systems, the nuclear-powered cruise missile and the nuclear-armed unmanned underwater vehicle, the Status 6, I don't see the US developing those for two reasons. Firstly, the nuclear-powered cruise missile the Russians are developing. If it's the same as what the US developed in the 1950s, it spews radioactivity as it flies. That's not a good thing to happen. And in terms of the unmanned underwater vehicle, the Status 6, that's a very high-yield warhead that's jacketed by cobalt, and that is designed to produce mass radiation that lasts for a long time. The US rejected cobalt weapons in the 1950s as immoral. So I don't see the US following the Russians in those two weapons. But certainly hypersonic weapons, yes, the US will be following close attention to those.
Which other powers are likely to be alarmed by what President Putin has said in the past day?
I think the whole world should be alarmed, because basically what he's telegraphing is a willingness to consider use of nuclear weapons aggressively, to consider potential first strike and decapitation options for nuclear weapons. You know, he's moving directly away from the path that the US held throughout the Obama administration, which was to marginalize the role of nuclear weapons and delegitimize them. Putin is going the opposite path of legitimizing them and embracing them. And he's doing that through a doctrine known as preemptive de-escalation, which means the first use of nuclear weapons to coerce an opponent to back down, in this case NATO. So I think the whole world needs to respond to this. This is a very serious threat on the part of President Putin.
Does that mean that you believe Russia does pose a threat to Australia, and if yes, how much?
Well, I think from an Australian vantage, we are more focused probably on China and the rise of China. I think in terms of conventional military capabilities, no, Russia doesn't pose a threat to us. But in terms of the issue of nuclear weapons and the risk of tensions increasing and potentially a crisis leading to some sort of use of nuclear weapons, Russia does pose a real challenge, and we need to take the Russians on about this and basically make sure they understand that Australia will not stand idly by whilst the Russians blithely throw around nuclear threats and rattle nuclear sabers. We are for de-emphasis of nuclear weapons and delegitimizing nuclear weapons. The Russians are going down the opposite path.
And so just finally, am I right in summarising that you believe this moment shouldn't be underestimated and that this could be the beginning of a new arms race or a new version of the Cold War?
I certainly don't think we should dismiss it out of hand. I think we should look seriously at the technologies that he's developing. I think if those technologies are founded in fact, in other words, if they do have that nuclear-powered cruise missile and that if they are developing the Status 6 unmanned underwater vehicle, then we should respond and we should try to defeat those capabilities. And that could potentially involve a degree of action-reaction arms racing, which would be very unfortunate. It would be a step back into the Cold War that neither side really should be embracing.